Yeah, I mentioned a few things. First of all, you should know that I'm from a family of musicians. That means that my father was a composer and a good organ player and a pianist, and he was director of several conservatories. And I had an older brother who was a composer also. He's still alive. He works mostly for the theater and writes film music and things like that. So the first things was that I was educated with music all the time when I was a young kid. My mother was a pianist also. It was a big Catholic family. I was the youngest. Not only the youngest, I was an afterthought, if you don't know what that means. I make a big difference with my elder brothers and sisters. I'm 8 years younger than my younger sister. And I was taken to the piano all the time, and I had to play piano four hands with my mother, with my sisters, with my brothers. So the whole classical repertoire I know basically because of I played it with my family, my brothers and sisters. But when I started to be, when I got older, I must say that especially jazz music had a strong influence on my development as a composer. When I was in between my 10th and my 20th, I was much more interested in 20th century music and in jazz than in any of the classical music. I was bored always when I listened to Schumann or Beethoven or Mozart, and it bored me very much. But then already at school, I couldn't concentrate very well at school because I was busy with playing on the piano the whole day and playing jazz with my friends and so on. And also, I was perfectly able to. I was a good sight reader on the piano also. So we continued to play. I accompanied my sister, who was a singer all the time. That's where I got my repertoire knowledge of the repertoire from. But also in the same period, um, I listened enormous amount to the radio, which was the only, apart from concerts of course, but the radio was a very important source for developing your knowledge of repertoire. Even up till now, I must say that almost every piece of music I hear, if I don't know it, I can trace it into precise about 20 or 30 years when it is composed. Let's say from 1500 on. Before that it gets a little bit difficult, and you can make mistakes very much in between 1400 and 1450, of course. But let's say from 1550, I'm quite precise even where it has been composed. My father teach me very strongly about geographical differences in musical composing, specifically because he was quite contrary to the ruling culture in Holland. He was anti-German and pro-French. This has to do with the fact that we were Catholic, I think. You should know that until 1853 the Catholics were suppressed in Holland, and the freedom of religion was only established in the halfway the 19th century, because the Protestants, the Calvinists basically, had won the anti-imperialist struggle against the Catholic Spanish, who were ruling Holland in the 16th century. So it had to do with this war also, which has been important. I tell you this because the fight against the Spanish and the establishment of the Dutch Republic in 1600 has been the subject of the first part of my opera, De Materie. So then, what happened then? When I was about 15 or 16 years old, it was very clear that I was totally unable to do anything else than music. So we decided to send me to the conservatory. At that time, my father was. We were living in The Hague, where he was director of the conservatory, and I did my entrance examination. And my father, being extremely afraid of being accused from being a nepotist, I remember he said, took me in for the commission, and after my examination, he said, "Well, Louis, the gentlemen want to try it with you." And now, finally, after having done myself a lot of examinations, I think back to that examination as being a very good entrance examination. But he didn't want me to know too well that things went quite well at that. I played a little piano piece of myself also. So I did theory, piano, and composition, three main studies. Then my father became sick, and the position of director was taken over by Kees van Barren, who is known as, let's say, the first Dutch composer who was seriously involved with 12-tone music. He was, let's say, the Leibowitz or the Krenek of Holland. That's more or less that generation also. He died also. And Kees van Barren taught us the Viennese school, which for me was a totally closed book because my father didn't like German music. He liked some of Berg, he liked Wozzeck. The score of Wozzeck was in the house, and there was some Webern in the house, but he considered it as interesting but German. Also the Austrians. So then, that was the late 50s, let's say, early 60s, no, late 50s. And I had my fellow friends, young composers, and we all were totally engaged with the avant-garde music at that time, which was of course the 12-tone music. And not only the Viennese school, but also we heard for the first time pieces of Stockhausen and Boulez and Berio. So when I did my examination, my final examination in '62, I decided to not to go to Stockhausen, not to go to Boulez, but to go to Berio, because he had something to do with my backgrounds, being educated in the Latin culture. And that lasted 2 years. 1 year I lived in Milan, 1 year in Berlin, where he got sort of Luciano got a lot of money to stay in Berlin, but there was a lot of American money involved with that, the Ford Foundation. And he took some students with him, but I didn't like it there at all. So after about half a year, I decided with the girlfriend, which I had then already, which is still my life companion, to move to Amsterdam, which was new for us too, because we lived in The Hague before that. And in Amsterdam I had several friends, from which one was Peter Schat, of course, who was another known composer of my generation in Holland. And from that time on, I started to basically to fill my time with composing all the time. I did do some piano playing, and still nowadays when I perform, I improvise. So the improvised music has been all the time extremely important, I think, in my development. And as you probably know, in Holland, specifically in Amsterdam, the scene of the musicians which came out of the jazz, the free jazz, which is they call themselves improvisational musicians, is an extremely strong scene in the Dutch musical scene. And in fact, I think the way there is a lot of composing around is done by composers who both deal with improvised music and avant-garde music. I think that's one of the most typical things of the Dutch musical scene. Now, nowadays when I perform with a very strange girl who should be called a singer, but she doesn't sing. She makes all kinds of strange noises. And I like to perform with her sometimes because she's the only person from which I have no idea which will come in the next minute. It can be a strange bird song, or suddenly she starts singing Kurt Weill types, Lotte Lenya, and all the things in between she does. And that's very challenging to perform with because you have no idea what is going to happen. Well, the last thing we could mention is that, which has to do with the tradition of dealing with 20th century avant-garde music since my youth, and dealing with jazz, specifically American music. Not only American jazz, but also American avant-garde music. I mean, Misha Mengelberg, who was another good friend at the conservatory also, and me, were probably the few people who dealt with John Cage in the late 50s and the early 60s. And we knew Lamont Young, we were dealing with fluxus also, especially Misha. So I met Terry Riley in Darmstadt in '62. I mean, he was the only guy, and Erik Andersen from Denmark, who I liked to talk with, because they had a much more fresh approach to composing than all the academic German and especially and French composers at that time, which is still nowadays, I think 90% of the avant-garde music is composed by what I call academic or serial or neo-serial or complex composers, which I consider basically as which has to do with the orientation towards Schoenberg. And I must say that as I have quite clearly explained already, is not at all the route I'm busy with in composing. So, meeting Terry Riley, and then Frederick Shevsky, who came in 1970 with the recording of In C, that has made an enormous impact on me too. And in the meantime, Steve Reich visited Holland in 72 or something, 71, who was totally unknown at that time, but I immediately liked his music very much. That was the time that Phil Glass was playing in his group still. So Phil and Steve and me are more or less of the same generation, but more than Peter Schat and Jan van Vlijm, who are much more oriented towards Schoenberg and chromaticism. I felt immediately strongly tended towards the American avant-garde at that time too. Well, when you put all those things together, you sort of have an idea why I started composing the things I did from the 70s on. Yeah, he's right. But I think the Staat has not only has more to do with Terry Riley than with Steve Reich, but that's more or less a coincidence. I think what you can say about all of the three of us is that we not only that we only oriented ourselves more on the Stravinskyan type of music than the Schoenbergian, but we had a broader scope towards what the Americans call world music, which we would call non-Western music. And I remember, for instance, by writing the Staat, how much I was influenced also by Varese, for instance. There's a lot of some Varese in the piece also, I think. But specifically for the first chorus, by the chord music from Yogyakarta, where you have a lot of fast moving in the gamelan and these long melodies in the female chorus. And I found that extremely interesting, this combination. You can say that it's a sort of Pelog kind of scale which I used in the first chorus. So the influence of non-Western music seemed to be, like jazz, I think, an important part of how to deal with other kinds of pitch material, I think. I think that my visit to Japan in 71, where I heard no theater and kabuki and gagaku, has been, for instance, influential for the sound and the thinking of the piece The Tact, which when I heard it for the first time, a teacher of the conservatory in Den Haag, where I teach since the 70s, who was a connoisseur of non-Western, especially Japanese music, he said, these chords remind me of the show, the mouth organ, in the gagaku. And I said, that's right, I forgot that. But I remember that when I was listening to the gagaku, that I was very much impressed, and I said to myself, once I will do something with this. But it was totally unconscious. And that came back more or less suddenly, to my surprise, and the guy had to explain me that it reminded him of the shows in the gagaku. That's another very concrete example of using, let's say, non-Western musical material. So that's basically the beginning, or well, it's more than that probably. It's true, and we can all read that in the book of Adorno, of course, that he showed up ideas about this contradiction. I totally disagree with the book of Adorno. I think all he says about Schoenberg is much more suitable for Stravinsky. And what he says about Stravinsky, I think, tells me much more about Schoenberg. For instance, about the schizophrenia and the paranoia, the aspect of the craziness in the mind, which he considers to be present in the music of Stravinsky, I think is very clearly present in the music of Schoenberg. It was Vienna where the psychiatry became extremely important, it was not in France or in America. It has started all with Freud and Jung, of course, in Austria. And I think this complexity of thinking about the mind, you will hear much more clearly in the music of Schoenberg and Stravinsky. I'm absolutely sure that the discussion in between the totally different approach to composing between Schoenberg and Stravinsky is extremely relevant also in the second half of this century, simply because I think, and that has been very strong in the 50s and the early 60s, that most of the young composers all over the world, even in Korea or Japan or wherever you can look, developed themselves out of the generation of Boulez and Stockhausen, and the other ones, of course, which definitely find their roots in the Viennese school. So up to Ferneyhough, which is even younger than I am, a composer, um, to make it a little bit brutal, I would say Ferneyhough sounds like you play 6 pieces of Schoenberg at the same time. And it has absolutely nothing to do with all the rules I mentioned to you, where I deal with. Up to, I didn't mention composers like Honegger, which I think is very important, or Roussel, which I esteem very highly, or up to Chausson, or a lot of French Romanticism I like much more than if I like Romanticism, it's the French reserved, the Romanticism, which has this nice, I would almost say, classicist distance towards the expression. So I like, well, I would say up till Fauré, I deal with that much easier than with the German. Except for those who have been influenced by the French, like Stravinsky. That's a composer I like also in that part of the world. But to answer your question, I think that thinking of the fact that 90% of the avant-garde, so-called avant-garde composers nowadays still deal with the chromaticism of Schoenberg, I think the discussion about the difference in approach between those two composers is quite relevant to have. That's 2 questions, effectively. Well, no, I can put it in one answer. When you ask me about what we should do to develop the future of music, I'm this strange kind of person who feels or thinks that he has an duty towards inventing music. I think we have the duty to develop the musical language, which is quite, yeah, it's strange to say such a thing. There are a lot of people who don't care about the future, they just write. But I have the feeling that I feel that sort of, in a strange way, a responsibility to help the music forward, which is very strange to say, of course. And it's very clear in what I do, I think, even on very general listening, is that, to put it in a technical way, that it's clear that I deal with elements which have to do with tonality. On what kind of level, that's another question. That means that, first of all, I deal with the combination of diatonic and chromatic material. And I think that is what we can learn from the Rite of Spring of Stravinsky, which I consider as much more the piece which leads us to the 21st century than, let's say, the Film for Orchestra Studio of Schoenberg. Because Stravinsky is probably the first one who was able to say something new about this combination. Of course, he the Sacre is not thinkable without Debussy, for instance, who is one composer who thought about it in the same way, I would say. But in the Sacre, that's one of the first pieces where you have an extremely intense combination of different musical material when we talk about pitch, which is diatonic and chromatic material combined with each other. That's what I do basically all the time, in all kinds of different ways. Of course, every piece has his own harmonies and his own pitch material, so I try to not to repeat myself and to find other ways of organization in every piece in another way. Another thing which you is easily distinguishable is the use of pulsating rhythms. That I try to, and that has to do with my idea about harmony and tonality, and that brings the pulsating, can be extremely irregular, of course, but pulse rhythms has to do with a wish to recreate a situation where harmony seems to have tensions from one to each other. And as soon as you deal with that, you deal with something which has to do with tonality, on what kind of level. It can be on a very profound level also. And that means that you deal with a musical time instead of real time. The basic problem of serial music, let's use that word for it, can be totally free and intuitive, but as long as it sounds like that, only deals with real time. So fermatas are just waiting in real time, it's watch time. And there is not a tendency to create harmonies, it's basically a harmonic question, who tend to go to another harmony. They do go, but it could be another one because there are no, um, probably not only structural but also no acoustical or musical psychological reasons to have that harmony instead of the other one. And that's specifically when you deal with rhythms who pulse. From that moment on, you don't have to, but you can deal with the tension in between harmonies which deal with tonality. Basically, a subject where I talk a lot about with my students is the question of the harmonic rhythm, of course. And that is a subject which absolutely does not exist in serial music. And I think that's one of the most important aspects of musical thinking. When you really think about thinking, about thoughts in music, but that means that one phrase you say should be in any relation of the next phrase, and that lacks in the serial music. But I must say I was the first serial composer in Holland, for instance, so I have studied it very carefully and I know a lot about it. The piece series for two pianos, it's on a very simple level, but all the parameters are organized by the number 12. It's in fact quite simple. So I must say, to quote Stockhausen, that serialism, that means counting with numbers, basically, is in my blood now. So even a piece like the Materie, which sounds not at all, it sounds very strict and formalistic in a way, because there are so many limitations in the material, in every part, on all kinds of different levels. But apart from that, I use a lot of numbers and counting in the piece all the time. And that probably has to do with my serial background. Not only because the master who I study every day, who counted much more than any serial composer, is of course Johann Sebastian Bach. And he is the guy who teaches me also, in fact every day almost, how to deal with this limitation of material. You will see that in every prelude in the World Temperate Clavier, there is an limitation of intervals even. There are some ones where he has only major thirds on the first count of the bar, for instance. There are a lot of examples of how he, almost like Steve Reich, he limits his interval material, and it's extremely important for composers to, at least for me, I don't know for other ones, that you learn to develop your ideas with limiting your material. That's what I do all the time. And then, of course, another important influence, I think, on my thinking has been something like, how would I call it, conceptual art. So from the later 70s, most of the pieces, it's very clear that you can describe them in one or two phrases. What is the musical subject of the piece? That's why I give this meta-linguistic titles to my pieces also, because it deals with a certain aspect of music. And to do that, I have to take out a lot of other material and to limit it to one or two musical subjects, or one or two harmonies, for instance, also. And this idea of composing process music or conceptual music, I think has to do with the art movement of conceptual art. Like minimal art was before the minimal music also. And when I spoke Steve Reich for the first time in '71, in fact he knew only two names in Holland. It was Misha Melberg and me. So he called Misha, and Misha called me, and we met at Misha's place. And the guy was totally unknown. In fact, he said, "My music cannot be understood by music audience, and I play only in galleries." It's very interesting. This has really changed now, I think. But that was the time that he almost just started with dealing with his own group, because before that he did all the electronic things, the phasings. So in a way, I felt always more at ease with the strange guys, not the academic guys. Frederick Rzeszewski was a good friend already in the early 60s, and via Frederick I met Cornelius Cardew also, who I liked very much. And that I felt very strongly related to that kind of people. It has to do with pop, not only with pop, but also with jazz, I think.
Yeah.
It comes from the jazz, that's my generation. I'm older than pop, my children would be from the pop generation, I think. But I listen a lot to it, on all kinds of different places. Mostly in the car, I do a lot of listening in the car. I listen a lot to MTV, of course, also. And I have a slightly a racist preference to black pop music, I must say. I like soul and hip hop and rap and the funky type things also. And a few days ago, I got a nice package from America from a young composer called David Lang, one of those who organizes one of the most interesting festivals in New York, which is called Bang on a Can, and where I have been performed. This generation likes me there also. And he sent me a gigantic, you should see it downstairs, gigantic towel of Janet Jackson. And she's one of my favorite singers, I must say. That kind of music I like a lot. Yeah. It's extremely cold and precise, almost I would say classicistic. And most of that time, I like her more than her brother, I think. But I like her brother more than Prince also. So that's a question of taste. And not one song I like better than the other one, for instance. I like Anita Baker a lot. In fact, for my next piece, I'm going to use one of her melodies, I think. But that's another story. Well, I should tell you that I got a commission for a group in California called Ear Unit. And I am intending to write a piece in the form of a chorale fantasy of Bach for organ. What does that mean? That you have a basic construction for the whole piece of fast moving music, mostly a sort of canonic, contrapuntal. And then on all kinds of different ways she does that, but specifically at a certain moment, totally unexpectedly, shows up these long lines of the chorale. Da, 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 da. And he seems to be able to create, again, we have talked about it in the beginning tonight, a very interesting, I would say, dialectical combination of fast and slow music. And that's one of my main goals, to write a big piece which is all the time fast and slow. And I don't know how to do that, it's very ambitious. And I hope to do that once. And I'm going to make for Ear Unit a little etude in this sense. And that means that the pianos and the percussion and they have all kinds of electronic things play fast 16th notes, mostly in the bass and the middle register. And then from time to time, these two wind instruments and two strings play extremely slowly, like in Bach, the Mystery of Anita Baker, which you will only recognize when you know the song very well and you know my piece very well. But I'm not sure if I will do it because I fear problems with ASCAP and all that kind of money problems and the rights and royalties. But I like to think about it this way now. And if I don't know how to handle this problem. I mean, in the concrete social thing yet. But it doesn't make any difference. It could have been that song. I can write my own pop song. It's slow values, of course, also. But when you put it in very slow, regular values, that means that you totally alienate it from the original, of course. Exactly like Bach did with the Lutherian chorales. Now everybody knew those melodies, so they could follow it. But sometimes they are also hidden in a way that you have really to study the score before you find out which melody it is. And of course he is a genius, so he, in most cases you will see that in the chorale fantasy he deals also in the fast moving, also with the chorale, in a very fast way, and all kinds of permutations. So that's another way of dealing with it. I think I will do that, and I will find out the harmonic system out of the melody of Anita Baker. Well, it's not her melody, it's another guy who composed the song. Temper thing. In fact, the beginning is already a combination of fast moving and slow moving. Well, everybody has to deal with it his own way, but there are a lot of things which I can use very well. Basically, is thinking about melodic bass lines. That's very important. The contrary, one of the big differences between pop music and jazz is that the bass has become much more melodic, and that has not only to do with the development of style, but also with the development of the instrumentation. So another important development in pop music is the use of the bass guitar. And I picked that already a long time ago. I liked that instrument very much. And I started writing for the bass guitar already for the Staat, and before that I think. And at that time in Holland there was only one guy who really could read notes and play the bass guitar. And he said this part is totally impossible, and he just sort of played around. Nowadays I can call 10 guys in Amsterdam to play that part. And I think that's a very concrete example of how to use the advantages of pop music. Now, another example that's about instrumentation, but that's an important parameter in music, of course. In the materia, I use two synthesizers. In my next piece, I will do that again, and in the opera, I will do it also. And I can now really get the sounds I want out of the synthesizers, which was, let's say, in 10 years ago, was it quite difficult, and the difference in quality is enormous between the old cork and things like that, and what you have nowadays. It's a big difference. So I can deal with electronica in a way which I have to thank the pop development for. Now, when you talk about the pure musical material, that's quite poor and quite simple. I'm not really interested except for 6 or 7 part chords. But they are much more developed in jazz already. So the harmony in pop music is not as far developed as it was at Stan Kenton's time, for instance. So harmony, well, they use 6 staples of, or the building of triads. They're very good at that. But I think that is a minor aspect of the pop music. The combination of different pulsative rhythms can be very interesting sometimes. Difference in slow singing and fast moving bass lines, which is, I think, very interesting. The instrumentation we have talked about. But very important, what we have to learn from pop music is the interpretation. I think a big difference between, one of the important difference between my music and Fernihof's music is that he writes everything down until the smallest detail. And I try to clean my scores as much as possible from dynamics, from ritardandi, from articulation, all kinds of things which provide musicians to articulate the way you want. To the contrary, I try to avoid all those things in my scores and to work with musicians myself and finding out exactly the way I want, or I want to have it. But in a lot of cases, like with the Volharding or with Hoketus, or to give you another example about my string quartet, I like it much more to be in a collaboration situation with musicians and to learn from them how they articulate, specifically when they come from different experiences in music. So in Hoketus I had these two folk musicians who played panpipe and all kinds of string instruments. And I think the way Hoketus is played and performed is not only my piece. It has very strongly to do with an attitude where I feel a collaborator with musicians. Like it has been always, and that's what we learn from pop music, that it's not only the pitches of the song, but it's the interpretation of the musicians which make the thing it is. And that's very important. And that makes, I think, the gap, the so-called gap between avant-garde music and the public, has already to do, this I said it already in the 60s, it's an old joke for me, but has to do with the gap in between the composer and the musicians. People, and all normal average people feel, I mean even probably this afternoon, well this is a very good string quartet, but they feel that there's a gigantic distance between the musicians and the music. You see? Compared to what Prince does when he performs. And I think, I'm sure probably you have never heard Hoketus live, but when you saw it live, it was very clear that those people played their own music in a way, and that made it immediately brought it to a bigger audience also, because they saw that the musicians were not alienated from what they were doing, and that they didn't do it for money, but they did it for pleasure also. It came from their heart and body, and that's a very important aspect we have to learn from pop music. I did work with, she's something in between jazz and pop singer, funky singer,
Yeah.
and beautiful girl um, who I worked already with for the performance of the Staat in Holland, where I needed four singers, which were jazz singers in the first performance. And later I wrote a little song for her on a Spanish text, which she performed as the violin. And after that I got this commission from England to make a video which should have something to do with Mozart. I asked them to call Greenaway because I wanted him to make the images for the film. And then I met Greenaway. He was quite interested, in fact, much more than I expected. And I said I want to write songs because I wanted to work with that girl again. And he was totally agreeing with that. And we decided for a form, song, instrumental, etc. And then he made the texts for the songs, and I started writing the songs first. And on the video you will find this girl performing these songs. But I can't say that I write pop music. That's not true. I use elements, but my music doesn't really sound like pop music at all. Well, I use instruments. I use pulsating rhythms. I use harmonies, which could come out of the more traditional harmony of pop music. And I use riffs, yeah, probably short motives, that sort of things. And I must say that also I wanted to work with Greenaway. First of all, I think he's a fantastic filmmaker. But I wanted to make an opera with him. That was my main idea behind it. So the first meeting we had here in this house, I said, I consider this video as a sort of etude because I want to make an opera with you. And I could say that because I knew from the director of the Dutch opera that he had talked with Greenaway, and Greenaway had said to him that he wanted to write operas now. And when you see his latest films, you will find out that
they're very operatic. Yes.
too many images. He should go out of the little screen. He needs more space than that. So then he made a libretto, and I didn't like that very much. He has made a film out of that now. I like the subject very much. It's about a baby who is declared holy, and her parts of her body are sold as relics. But I didn't like the way the libretto was constructed. I had to compose dialogues, more or less like Strauss or Berg. And that's not the kind of opera I want to write. I want to write an opera which has much more a structure like the Passions of Bach, which is much more classicistic in a way. Non-developmental in a way. It may be development in the action and in the music, but I don't want to have the singing being part of the action. Is that clear? No, I had to explain to him, and he understood it very well. And now he is busy writing text for a totally different project, which, if things go the way I want, it will be performed in '94. And in the meantime, for '93, we will do a theatrical version, also like a little etude, of the Mozart video. A theatrical version for a little project in The Hague in '93. But it's a little etude also. Basically, I will work for the next 1 year and a half at evening long opera for '94. Yeah, sometimes. I start a little bit like Mozart. No, finally only in the first part. And then I quote two little Mozart sonatas. But it has very little to do with Mozart. And the movie itself has very little to do with Mozart also. It's about creation of man. And he mentions Mozart once, but it has, and you see some 18th century costumes and things like that. But it has very little to do with Mozart. It has to do with genius. It's creation of man. But the movie music, the video music, is extremely accessible, I must say, compared to a lot of other things I have done. But that has not only to do with the development of trying to find borderlines, and what I do now in the opera is something in between materia and the video, somewhere in the middle. No, it's a totally different subject. In fact, the one I rejected, the baby of Macon, the French city, he has made a film out of that already this year. That's why he couldn't find time to write the libretto for the next work. I have already 10 pages, and I have composed the first 20 minutes. But I told him that I need a survey now. I need the whole thing. He asked the last telephone call. He didn't know that. Do you work from beginning to the end, or do you? And I said that in this case I wanted to write from the beginning to the end. And I will, yeah, the ensemble will be quite a little bit smaller than Materie, but no clarinets. I use only saxophones for the flutes and oboes, saxophones, no clarinets, no bassoons, and of course all the brass and one synthesizer, one harp, solo strings, banjo. He's going to direct it too, yeah. And I'm very proud of the fact that I will be the person who brings him into the theater, because it's totally new for him too. I mean, lighting is a totally different way than you can do with film, of course, and the tempo of the movement of the images is for him totally new also. So I'm very curious how he will manage to do that, all that sort of things. But I have fully confidence in him. I think he's very interesting. The only thing which is interesting me very much is that when you work specifically when you work for the theater, I deal with what I call the problem of accessibility. I don't know if that immediately rings a bell to you, but for me, specifically when you work for the theater, you seem to, it seems for me more relevant to deal with what Stockhausen calls more preformed material. So where you don't, when you really attack tonal functions which have been used earlier in a totally different context or whatever, but specifically also in an ironic way, a sort of strange distance way. And I think in my experiment for the opera, also because the script is very strange and surrealistic, and I think ironic also. I don't know if he agrees with that. I want to create a musical situation in which also you have this kind of dialectical approach to what I call known, recognizable music. And that's on. I try to find a borderline somewhere in between the opera, Materie, where I deal with accessibility in a way also, already, especially in the second part, I think, and the video, which is certainly much more accessible than a lot of other pieces I've done in the 70s. Well, I should start with the end probably. I think there are two levels on which a composer can work with this subject within his own job, in his own work. Which is that's the part I'm going to answer. I mean, you can become a member of a party and being active in the party, but that's besides being a composer. As long as you are a composer and you want to deal with politics as a composer, there are two levels on which you, I think, finally, and we have had thousands of years of discussions about that, so I don't want to get up all these discussions again. But I think now there are two levels of thinking about politics in your work. In the first place, which is what Marx would call the bourgeois level, is that you are motivated to use political texts for your pieces, which I did, for instance, in the Staat and the Mausoleum also. And this is perfectly relevant. However, I think you should be in a certain way quite reluctant in taking heavy subjects and use them as an aesthetical argument in your piece. I'm basically very reluctant with that. And there are specifically a lot of subjects I will never tackle, like Anne Frank or those things that are too difficult for me. I'm not in that position, I think. But there is another level, which is the second level, which I think is extremely relevant, is that you are aware of the fact that music production has a social, at least probably not a political, but has a social meaning. and that you can do something about who is playing your music, where and for whom. Now, in the early 70s, I have been much more radical about it than probably I have now. Not only because I am less radical, because I think I am not, but because the time has changed, the world has changed. So, with founding the Volharding, it was very clear that we wanted the musicians in the first place, they were your first political subject, should never do something which they don't like. They should never do something which is they do only for money. All these kinds of things we found totally wrong. So also they should not. They should decide together what are you going to play and how are you going to play. And I must say the orchestra functions still this way nowadays. That you could call sort of internalized democracy as much as possible, of course. And I think in such a way dealing with musicians, you can be much more honest about your social functioning as a composer. It's more, it's less alienated. We have used that word before. I don't really deal anymore with this democratic aspect of. Well, probably I do. I don't know, but I'm now much more in the luxurious, almost spoiled position that I can write large pieces for large ensembles, which I know already, and they know me, they know my music, they like my music, and I know I can count on them. So I have my Communist Party around me, I would say, my friends around me, and it goes now even so far. But I'm in that sense a very luxury situation that a production like the Materie, the opera, has been produced by different ensembles for new music together in one big thing, and that's of course an almost ideal situation in which I think still that you hear it in the music, that you hear that people know very well what they are doing. I have never heard such a good performance of the Staat anywhere in the world than I had 2 weeks ago in Utrecht, done by the Dutch Wind Ensemble, which was a real combination of extremely precise and very wild and savage, which the piece needs, of course. And that has to do with experience, of course, and the people, but it has to do with the fact that people know the piece now. But because in the 70s it was extremely difficult. Really, the first record, it's almost a different piece from what you hear now. So they know the piece, but they like the piece also. And I have had different performances, all kinds of different places in the world, where I deal with orchestra musicians and they don't like it, and it is a bad performance. It's as simple as that. Yeah. Enjoyable, I think I must be very honest in that. I feel very much at home in the generation who certainly has been influenced by me, is what I would like to call midtown composers in New York, and probably California also, but I don't know them as well as the New Yorkers. So the guys who deal basically with pulse rhythms and electronic amplification, but use that for somewhat complex chromatic and diatonic material. Downtown it's all and uptown it's Elliot Carter, so it's somewhere in midtown, isn't it? They all live downtown, of course. And these are the people around Bang on the Can, like David Lang I mentioned, Jeff Brooks I like Michael Gordon, somewhat different, who's an organizer also of Bang on the Can. Julie Wolfe, have you ever heard of her? It's the wife of Michael Gordon. I met in North Carolina another friend. They all come from Yale. They just finished Yale before I came there. And another guy from Yale I like is Scott Lindroth, but you can't write those names. I have to write them for you. You don't know how to spell them. I should write it for you. And of course I had already a long time ago, Michael Turkey was visiting me. And I said to him that he was very talented, but that his talent was his enemy. And he has remembered that very well. And I must have said something different because I met him last week in London on a concert where both Gordon and Lang and my piece was performed. And he said to me, you know that I said I like Green music a lot. This is one of his orchestra pieces. And he said, that is the piece I made you listen to in 10 years ago or something like that. And you said composers should not be too accessible. I warned him for that already. Yeah, it seems so when you hear when I hear what I say, that I'm basically, apart from the Dutch scene, which I know very well, of course,
Yeah.
I'm mostly interested in what happens in America and Canada. Comes up now too. And that's the part of the world. Australia, strange enough, also the Anglo-Saxon part of the world knows me better than countries like Germany or France. They don't know me at all. But in America, all young composers know me, I suppose. It has something to do with approach or attitude, I think. They recognize something of themselves also in my music, I suppose. I like Feldman a lot also. And of course, I have my own European background, so there are some pieces of Stockhausen which I consider as being extremely important, where I think a lot about all the time, like Inori. It's a fantastic piece, or Trans. So there was this other question about symphony orchestra. It's very clear that since the 60s I avoid writing for symphony orchestra. And I have done it once in 81. I had a commission from San Francisco, where there was at that time a Dutch conductor also, Edo de Waard. And well, I said yes. I wanted to try it again, let's say. And I wrote this piece, The Snelheid, Velocity. And I had very bad experiences with him. And again, when was that? I've always bad experiences. They don't like my music. So why should I bother those people? And not only that, which is a very good reason, in fact, not to do it. They can't play it well also. It doesn't work. But apart from that, another reason is that I don't think that the sound of a symphony orchestra, whatever you imagine in kind of music, is not the kind of sound I need to develop my language. I need other instruments. So I need to send away half of the orchestra and put 20 freelance musicians there. And then it doesn't work, then it's not symphony orchestra, then it's just simply this large ensemble where I like to write for. And I feel also as a responsibility to write large pieces for large ensembles. Otherwise, you cannot be in polemic with the history. Can you see that? I think it's too easy to write only little things for little chamber groups, because then you sort of ignore the development of the late 19th century. And we have to give an answer to the aspects which are tackled by Mahler and Bruckner. We have to deal with those problems also in sound, in mass sound, symphonic sound.